One morning, I woke up like every other day, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down to check my pension account. The money I had worked for all my life, the money that was supposed to keep me safe in these later years. But when the screen lit up, my heart nearly stopped because the balance was gone. Every single dollar had vanished. And right there in black and white was the name of the one person I trusted most. Thank you for watching and staying with me. I truly appreciate every single one of you. And before I go on with this story, let me ask you something. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because it means more than you know to feel that I am not alone as I share this with you. Now, when I saw that empty account on the screen, I felt the air leave my chest. My hands trembled, and I thought maybe it was some mistake. Maybe a bank error that could be fixed with one call. But the truth was colder than I could stand, because right there was her name printed so clear. The very person I had raised with everything I had, the one I thought would stand by me when my bones grew weak, had taken it all and left me staring at nothing but numbers that told me I had been robbed of not only my savings but of my trust. I sat there for a long while with the silence in the room pressing down on me, and it felt as though the walls themselves were leaning closer, watching me break. Yet even in that silence, something deep inside whispered that this would not be the end of my story. Not the way they expected it to be. I remember sitting there with my head in my hands, trying to steady my breathing as the weight of it all pressed down on me. And in that moment, memories came flooding back. Memories of the years I had spent working myself to the bone. Waking up before the sun, coming home after dark, saving every dollar I could, because I believed that one day it would protect me, that it would allow me to live with a little comfort after giving so much of my life to hard labor. I remembered skipping meals so she could eat better, working double shifts so she could go to school with shoes that didn't have holes. I remembered the birthdays where I handed her gifts, bought with tired hands, but wrapped in all the love I had. I thought of the nights I went without sleep, worrying if I was doing enough, if she would understand that every sacrifice I made was so she could have more than I ever had. And as I sat there staring at that empty account, I realized that all those sacrifices, every long hour, every aching back, had been poured into something that was now gone. Stolen by the very person I had poured my soul into raising. It cut deeper than any knife could. Because it wasn't just money taken from me, it was trust, it was respect, it was the bond I thought could never be broken. And yet here I was, old, tired, and betrayed, left with nothing but my shaking hands and a hollow ache in my chest. I told myself over and over that it couldn't be true. But the evidence was right there, in black and white, cold and merciless. And no matter how much I wanted to deny it, I could not escape what had been done to me. And in that moment, I felt something inside me harden, not out of hate, but out of a need to survive. Out of a need to hold on to the little dignity I had left. Because if I allowed this betrayal to crush me completely, then all those years of sacrifice would have been for nothing, and I could not let that be the final chapter of my life. I sat in that chair for what felt like hours, my eyes fixed on the numbers on the screen that mocked me with their emptiness. And as the weight of it pressed down on me, I could not stop the flood of memories that carried me back through the years. I thought of the first day I held her in my arms and swore silently that I would give her the life I never had. I thought of the nights when money was so tight I chose to go without new clothes so she could walk into school with pride. I thought of the days when my hands were cracked and blistered from hard work, yet I still managed to smile when she came running through the door. Her laughter, once my greatest treasure. I remembered her teenage years, when she started drifting a little, pulling away from me, and though it hurt, I told myself it was just the way of growing up. That she would come back around because love and blood should always bring us home again. And then came that man, smooth-talking, polished, the kind who knew how to look a father in the eye with false charm. And though something in my gut tightened each time I saw him, I pushed it aside because I wanted to believe that if she was happy, then I should be happy too. But happiness built on lies is nothing more than a trap waiting to spring. And looking back now, I can see the signs so clearly. The secretive phone calls, the sudden expenses, the way she avoided my questions by brushing them aside with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I told myself I was imagining things, that age was making me too suspicious. But the truth was, I had known deep down that something was wrong long before that morning when I saw my savings drained. And it breaks me to admit that I ignored those whispers inside me because I trusted too much and questioned too little. I wanted to believe in her goodness so badly that I closed my eyes to the storm that was already gathering. I remember once she asked me casually what would happen to my pension if I passed away. And I laughed it off, thinking she was only curious, never realizing that question was the first small crack in the dam that would one day burst. And even then, when she began to spend more time away, when nights stretched into days without seeing her, I clung to excuses that soothed my heart, telling myself she was busy, that she needed space, but in truth, she was slipping farther into his world and farther away from me. And I was too blind to hold her back. The betrayal did not begin with the transfer of money, no. It began much earlier, in those small, careless words, in the half-truths and secrets that slowly eroded the foundation of trust I had built. And by the time I realized the truth, it was already too late. She and that man had turned my life into ashes while smiling to my face, and the pain of that knowledge carved itself into me deeper than any wound because I had given her everything. Yet she chose to repay me with emptiness. And still, as I sat there broken, I told myself that I could not allow this betrayal to destroy me. Because if I did, then their greed would win twice. Once by taking my savings, and again by stealing my spirit. And I knew then that though my body was old, my will was not yet gone, and that I would find the strength to rise, to gather every piece of truth, and to one day face them not with anger in my voice, but with evidence in my hands. Because I may have been betrayed, but I refused to let betrayal be the last word written in my story. As I sat there holding on to the thought that I would not let betrayal be the last word in my story, I could not help but remember the many small moments that had built up to this wound. The way her tone had changed when she spoke to me, softer at first, as though she was hiding something, then sharper, dismissive, as though my questions were nothing more than an annoyance. I remembered the dinners where I would try to talk about the future, about how I had saved and planned for the years ahead, and she would roll her eyes or smile with a hint of impatience, saying things like how I worried too much, how I should spend more and live a little, words that stung but that I swallowed because I wanted peace. I wanted to believe she still respected me, but deep inside each remark carved a mark that I never forgot. And then there was him, that smooth-talking lover who looked at me with practiced charm, calling me sir as though respect came easy to his lips. Yet when I turned my back, I could feel the weight of his smirk pressing into me. He would speak of plans, of travels, of investments that sounded too clever to be honest. And though I held my tongue, I could sense his hunger. Not for her heart, but for what I had built with my own sweat. The way he watched me when I pulled out my pension statements. The way his eyes lingered on numbers that were not his to touch. I see it now so clearly, how he wrapped her in sweet lies and convinced her that my years of sacrifice were nothing more than a pile of cash waiting to be spent. And the worst part was not his cunning, but her willingness to believe him over me. Her father who had carried her through sickness, through sleepless nights, through the storms of life. I began to realize that betrayal does not come all at once, like a thief in the night. It arrives in pieces, in dismissive words, in careless laughter, in the way respect erodes grain by grain until nothing solid is left. And as I thought of those moments, my heart ached not only for what I had lost in money, but for what I had lost in her. The bond that once seemed unbreakable, now broken beyond recognition. Still, I knew I had to keep my silence. Because silence was not weakness, silence was my shield. And I promised myself that when the time came to speak, it would not be in anger shouted into empty air. It would be in truth, spoken in a place where lies could no longer hide. And though it hurt more than I can put into words, that promise was what kept me steady. That promise was what kept me alive. Holding on to that promise, I began to notice every little detail with sharper eyes, the way her phone would light up at the dinner table, and she would tilt it away from me as though I had no right to see, the way whispered conversations ended the moment I walked into a room. The sudden trips she explained with weak excuses that never matched her past honesty. I told myself to let it go, but in my heart, each moment was another stone added to the weight already pressing on my chest. And when I saw him picking her up one evening, his hand resting on the wheel of a car I knew he could never afford without someone else's money, I felt a chill that told me my fears were not just shadows of an old man's mind. I watched them drive away, laughing as though the world belonged to them, while I stood at the window staring into the dark. Feeling like a stranger in my own home, I tried to tell myself that love can make people blind, that perhaps she was only carried away by promises that would soon fade. But the truth deep down was clear. She was slipping further into his grasp, and I was being pushed further into the background. Every word I spoke seemed to bounce off her walls. Every gesture of care met with silence or irritation. And still, I held on, because I did not want to believe that blood could turn against me. Yet betrayal does not ask for belief. It unfolds regardless, and it was unfolding right before my eyes. I felt it, in the way she no longer asked for my advice, in the way she spoke about money as though it was nothing more than numbers on a screen, not the sweat and years behind it. I wanted to shake her, to remind her of the nights I stayed awake, worrying if she would have enough. But I knew those words would fall on ears already deafened by greed and his voice whispering in them, so I kept my silence, watching and waiting. Because sometimes the only way to fight betrayal is not by shouting into deaf ears, but by gathering the truth piece by piece until it is undeniable. And though the ache in my chest grew heavier each day, I held my ground, because I knew the day would come when the lies would meet the light, and I wanted to be ready when it did. Each day that passed seemed to carry more signs, more pieces of a puzzle that I wished I did not have to put together. But they were there all the same, waiting for me to see them, waiting for me to accept the truth I was too afraid to name. I began to notice that bills I had not signed for were arriving in the mail, subscriptions and purchases that I never made. Small things at first, things that could have been overlooked, but when I looked closer, I saw her handwriting on forms that should have never been touched, her signature where mine should have been, and I felt my stomach twist with the bitter taste of realization. I told myself, maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she had only meant to help. But then I found the bank slips hidden in her drawer. Slips that showed withdrawals and transfers that lined up perfectly with the growing emptiness in my account. And with every line I read, the world I thought I knew unraveled further. I could still hear her laughter in the kitchen, the sound that once warmed my heart, now echoing in my mind as a cruel reminder of the mask she wore while stealing everything I had worked for. And then there was him, always nearby in one way or another. His voice just a little too confident, his eyes just a little too sharp. I could feel his presence even when he was not in the room, a shadow that seemed to stretch over both of us, whispering into her ear promises of freedom and riches, if only she turned her back on the man who raised her. I wanted to believe she would resist, that love and memory would hold her back. But the evidence piling up before me told a story that love could not erase. One evening, as I sat at the table pretending to read the paper, I overheard them in the next room. Their voices low, but not low enough. Him saying that I would never notice, that I was too old, too trusting, too blind to stop them. And her soft laugh in reply, a laugh that broke something inside me because it was not the laugh of the little girl I remembered, it was the laugh of someone who had already chosen her side. I did not move. I did not speak. I just sat there with the paper in my hands, my eyes fixed on the words I could not read, my ears burning with the truth I could not yet confront. I realized then that suspicion was no longer suspicion. It was certainty, it was betrayal, standing in the open for me to see. And though every part of me wanted to storm into that room and demand answers, I knew that anger would win me nothing. I knew that if I spoke too soon, they would cover their tracks, and I would be left with nothing but my broken heart. So I swallowed the fury and I made a choice. I would gather every piece of proof. I would hold it close like a weapon hidden under my coat. And when the day came, when the moment was right, I would not face them in whispers and shadows. I would face them where lies have no place to hide. And in that silence, I promised myself that no matter how deep this betrayal cut me, I would not fall quietly. I would not be erased, and I would not let them believe that age had made me weak, because I still had strength, and I would use it to reclaim what was stolen from me. With that promise burning in my chest, I began to move differently, slower on the outside but sharper within. I kept my words gentle, my face calm, but my eyes never stopped watching, and every detail they left behind became another stone I stacked into the wall of truth I was building. I went through old mail carefully, finding receipts tucked away for hotel stays and dinners in places I had never set foot. I pulled copies of my bank statements and laid them side by side, tracing the trail of transfers with a pen until they formed a map that pointed directly to them. And each line I drew made my heart ache, but also hardened my resolve. I even found messages left open by mistake on her computer. Words between her and that man where they mocked me, called me stubborn, called me blind, and planned how they would take what they said I no longer needed. Reading those lines was like swallowing glass, every word cutting deep. Yet I did not let them see me bleed. I stayed silent, greeting her with the same warmth, answering her questions as though I knew nothing, because silence was my disguise. Silence gave me time, and with that time I began to gather not just papers, but strength. I spoke to my brother-in-law, who had once worn a badge, and when I showed him what I had found, he looked at me with sorrow, but also with pride. He told me I was not wrong to hold my silence. That proof speaks louder than anger. And together we began to collect every piece needed to bring the truth to light. The more I gathered, the less afraid I became, because I realized that betrayal loses its power when it is dragged into the open. And though the pain still gnawed at me each night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I knew those sleepless hours were not wasted. They were sharpening me, shaping me into someone who would not break. I told myself over and over that when the day came, I would not shout, I would not plead, I would simply stand with the truth in my hands and let the weight of their own choices crush them. Because what they had stolen was not just money, it was years of my life, and I would not let them walk away as though those years meant nothing. The more evidence I gathered, the more the silence around me began to feel like a companion rather than a prison. I carried the weight of their betrayal, but also the strength of knowing I was no longer blind. Each day I tucked another piece of paper into my folder, another receipt, another transaction, another signature that tied them tighter to the theft they thought would remain hidden. And with every page my resolve grew firmer. Still I said nothing. Still I greeted her with the same calm voice. Still I nodded when she spoke as if I were none the wiser. But inside me a storm was rising. Not one of rage that bursts and fades, but one of steady thunder that builds until it cannot be ignored. There were nights when I sat in the dark staring at that folder, my hands resting on its cover as if it were the shield that would protect what little I had left. And I asked myself again and again if I should confront her in the house, if I should demand answers right then and there. But each time the answer was no, because I knew shouting in these walls would not give me justice. It would only give them time to twist the truth. So I held my tongue and I sharpened my patience. I even began to imagine the day when I would place that folder on the table in front of a judge, when their smirks would vanish and their lies would choke in their throats. And that vision gave me peace, even as the nights grew longer and lonelier. There were moments when doubt tried to creep in, when the ache in my chest whispered that I was too old to fight this battle. But then I would remember the long years I worked, the sweat and pain that filled those savings, and I told myself that if I could endure all that, then I could endure this too. So I kept building my case in silence, waiting for the moment when the truth would speak louder than their betrayal ever could. The folder grew heavier with each passing week, not because of its weight in paper, but because of the truths it carried. And as I added each new page, I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. I was no longer the man sitting in shock before an empty bank account. I was no longer the father blinded by trust. I was becoming something else. A man forged by betrayal and steadied by patience. Yet even as I grew stronger, the pain did not fade. It lingered like a wound that refused to close, because every time I looked at her face, I saw the child I had once cradled, and it hurt to know that the same hands that had held onto mine so tightly when she was small had now signed away my future without hesitation. But pain has a way of sharpening the soul if you let it, and I chose not to drown in it, but to rise with it. Still, I kept my silence. Still, I acted as though nothing had changed, because I wanted her to believe that she was winning. I wanted her and that man to think I was too frail, too naive, too broken to notice. And in that belief, they grew careless. Their whispers grew bolder, their spending more reckless, and the trail they left became easier to follow. I began to notice expensive clothes in her closet, jewelry I had never seen before, gifts that came from money she could not have earned, and each one became another nail in the coffin of their lies. I remember one night when they sat at the table laughing softly, speaking about trips they planned, places they would go with the very money I had spent decades earning. And though every word stung like fire, I forced myself to stay still, to keep the calm mask upon my face, because I knew the time for calm would end in a place where their laughter would turn to silence. There were moments when she would test me, asking if I needed help with my bills or if I ever worried about running out of money, her tone coated with sweetness, but her eyes betraying a flicker of guilt. And I would smile back at her, telling her I trusted that everything would be fine, knowing that those words only deepened her illusion that I was blind. But I was not blind. I was watching every step, every slip, and every lie, and though it tore at my heart, I told myself again and again that the storm was coming, that justice was being carved slowly, and that patience was my greatest weapon. I knew the boiling point was near. I could feel it in the air of the house, in the way their confidence swelled with every stolen dollar. And I knew when that point came, I would not be caught off guard. I would be ready, not with anger or noise, but with the truth that would stand taller than all their schemes. Because when betrayal pushes a man into silence, it also pushes him into strength. And I was ready to prove that I had not been defeated, but prepared. The day came when I felt the boiling point could no longer be delayed. The silence had stretched far enough and the folder in my hands was ready to see the light. I remember waking early that morning with a calmness that surprised me. No shaking, no panic, only the steady rhythm of a man who had carried pain long enough and was ready to place it down before others to see. I called my brother-in-law, and together we walked into the lawyer's office. The folder pressed against my chest like a shield, and as I laid it on the table, the weight seemed to lift just a little. Page after page of evidence spread before us. Every receipt, every statement, every signature that proved what they had done. And though my heart still ached, there was a strange comfort in knowing the truth was no longer mine to bear alone. I watched the lawyer's eyes as he studied the documents, the way his brow furrowed deeper with each page, and finally he looked up at me with a quiet nod that said it all. I had been wronged, but I was not powerless. With his guidance and the steady hand of my brother-in-law, we set the wheels in motion, preparing for the day when their laughter would falter and their lies would crumble. In those days leading up to court, I carried myself with a stillness that made them think I was simply drifting further into old age. But inside me, the fire burned brighter. I even caught her once looking at me strangely, as if she sensed something had changed, but she brushed it aside and went back to her plans. And I let her believe what she wanted, because soon the truth would be louder than her excuses. When the moment finally arrived and I stepped into that courtroom, I walked not as a broken man, but as a father who had chosen dignity over despair. I stood steady while they fidgeted, and as the judge called for the evidence, my folder was opened, the silence in that room heavy enough to crush, and I knew then that the first reveal had begun. The ground beneath their feet was no longer steady, and the truth they thought would never be spoken was finally filling the air. As the evidence was laid out before the court, the silence grew so thick that even the sound of pages turning seemed to echo against the walls. I stood there watching the judge scan line after line, his expression changing slowly from calm to grave as the weight of the truth sank in. I glanced toward them and saw the color drain from his face. The smooth-talking lover who once smirked so easily, now shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his hands twitching as though he wished he could grab those papers and tear them apart. But it was too late. Every word and number had been recorded, every signature was undeniable. And for the first time I saw fear where arrogance had lived. My daughter sat beside him, her eyes downcast, her lips pressed tight, and though I had imagined anger or defiance, I saw only shame flickering across her features. As if she finally realized the hole she had dug was deeper than she could climb out of. The lawyer spoke with calm precision, pointing out the transfers, the false forms, the hidden accounts, and as each detail was read aloud, the walls seemed to close in tighter. I remembered every long night I had spent gathering those pages, every ache in my chest as I printed another statement. And now each of those moments stood here with me as allies. Turning my silence into a voice that could not be denied, the lover tried to speak, tried to twist the story into excuses. But the judge cut him short with a wave of the hand, telling him that the numbers did not lie, that his words could not erase the truth written so clearly in ink. I felt a strange calm wash over me, not joy, not triumph, but a deep, steady relief that justice had finally stepped into the light. I saw the confidence drain from him completely when the judge announced that their accounts would be frozen, that restitution would be ordered, and that the law would hold them accountable for every cent they had taken. The room was silent, except for the gavel striking, a sound that rang through me like a final bell, ending a long and bitter fight. I looked once more at my daughter, and though tears had begun to gather in her eyes, she did not look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the table, her shoulders trembling under the weight of what she had done. And though my heart broke all over again, I stood tall, because I had not come there for revenge, I had come for truth. And in that moment, the truth stood taller than all of us, unshaken, undeniable, and final. When the gavel struck for the last time and the judge's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, I felt years of weight lift from my shoulders, not because the money would ever mean the same to me again, but because the truth had been spoken in a place where it could not be twisted or ignored. I walked out of that courtroom, not as a man broken by betrayal, but as a man who had faced it head-on and refused to be erased. The lover sat pale and speechless, stripped of his charm, while my daughter remained quiet, her tears falling, but her eyes never daring to meet mine. And though my heart ached for what had been lost between us, I knew that dignity had been restored, and that mattered more than gold. Sometimes life teaches us that silence can be sharper than anger, that patience can build walls stronger than rage, and that even in old age there is a strength no betrayal can take away. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. I hope it touched you in some way, and if it did, please subscribe so you can hear more. And let me know in the comments what this story made you feel. Stay strong, stay wise, and stay blessed.